Hello, everybody. Bobby Medina here with my good buddy, the great Paul Barron. And today we have a very special guest. He is an internationally recognized trumpet player, composer, and music producer. He's studied at the Eastman School of Music, CalArts, and UCLA, where he's earned advanced degrees. He is a prolific member of the Los Angeles creative music scene, and he has released more than 25 albums of original music as a solo artist. And as well, he's supported over 60 other artists across nearly 90 releases on his own record label, Orenda Records. He frequently performs in the Hollywood studios for major film and television soundtracks. You may have heard him recently on Star Wars Trilogy, and with such notable composers also John Williams, Danny Elfman, James Newton Howard, to name just a few. He's also performed with such elite ensembles as the LA Philharmonic, the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, and the LA Opera. And his own music defies genre distinctions and draws from such disparate influences as jazz and black American music, metal and experimental rock, contemporary classical, folk music from around the globe, and a broad range of progressive music from the avant-garde. So please welcome Dan Rosenboom. Thank you for being here, Dan.
Hey everybody! Thank you so much for having me, you guys. It's great to get a chance to meet you and talk to you and share some time together.
All right.
Great.
Well, I'm going to throw out the first question, Dan. So we can get to know you better. Tell us about your background and your musical upbringing. Where'd you grow up, and who'd you study with, and so on.
Yeah. So I started playing music at a very early age. My father was a composer and pianist and violinist and computer musician, and involved in a lot of the avant-garde. So when I was 4, I started playing piano, and from there got really interested in music in general. And then when it was time to join the school band, around 9, 10 years old, that's when I picked up the trumpet. Because we happened to have one at the house, and I liked, sitting under the piano and messing around on it. And so throughout my childhood, I kind of continued playing those instruments together, piano and trumpet, all the way up until college, when I decided to focus more on the trumpet. Yes, where I grew up, I was born in the Bay Area, and then we moved down to Valencia, California, because my dad started teaching at California Institute of the Arts. And throughout high school, starting in junior high school and throughout high school, I studied with Roy Poper, who was in LA still at that time. And also with Wadada Leo Smith, who is now, getting some long overdue but really amazing recognition as a creative improviser. And then when I went to college, I went to the Eastman School of Music. Actually, I went to the Interlochen Arts Academy just for my senior year of high school and studied with Stan Friedman there. And then
He was one of my teachers, too. What a great guy.
Awesome. And then went to the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, where I studied with James Thompson. And then after undergrad, moved back out to California to do graduate degrees at UCLA and CalArts simultaneously. And so I've got to study with Ed Carroll at CalArts and Jens Lindemann at UCLA, as well as a variety of people who were not trumpet players. One of the things that was really cool about my time at CalArts was I was able to take private lessons with Vinny Golio, who's an amazing multi-woodwind improviser and composer, Miroslav Tadic, who's an incredible guitar player, Larry Kuntz, a wonderful guitar player, John Fumo as well on trumpet. Got to play in ensembles led by all these different people and start really branching out from the classical music perspective and getting into improvised music and folk music from various parts of the world. And then also through the other students, started getting into playing all sorts of other kinds of music, particularly a friend of mine who's a guitar player and composer and vocalist now, Jake Vossler, really brought me into like the heavy music world, like the metal realm, and we had a band together for a long time called Plots that was a sort of fusion of Balkan folk music and Eastern European folk music, and then also originals influenced by those rhythms and styles and scales, but mixed with like a sort of like experimental, like improvisational and heavy metal kind of rhythm section. So that was a lot of fun, and that kind of branched into all sorts of other things. Throughout the years, I've had a whole wide range of bands that I've experimented with, everything from like totally acoustic music, for everything from duo to 10-piece ensemble, and then a variety of electric projects as well that have incorporated mostly electric rhythm sections that are a little more like rock and fusion based, but still with kind of a contemporary harmonic approach to things, and more recently incorporating pedals and electronics. You can see some of the pedals there. And all the while was working in Los Angeles as a freelance trumpet player to make a living, and also I still love playing classical music, so I've been fortunate enough to have some opportunities to play with some wonderful colleagues here in LA and in some really great ensembles, and eventually got invited to play on some film soundtracks, and that's been sort of the mainstay of my career for the last several years, and is kind of brings us current. So there's a big range of things going on there, but a lot of fun, a lot of creativity, and a lot of sort of really dedicated focus to how to navigate all this different stuff.
Wow, very cool. I'm tired just listening to that, exhausted. I need a nap. Yeah, so, well, then tell us a little bit. I think it would be really interesting to know more about, how you got involved with studio work. And I think it would be, and especially during this COVID time. And then maybe you can touch on that and then also tell us a little bit about just a couple of maybe the special projects you have and what they consist of, and where you guys are playing or recording, how that's all working for you.
Yeah. So the studio world, you get this question a lot, like how do you get into the studio recording scene? And honestly, I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I think in my case, my philosophy, and the philosophy that I was sort of given to me by my teachers, was you want to basically just be in the scene, be developing a good reputation by being professional and collegial, and always showing up and doing a great job, but also being kind and cool to the people around you. And then over time, people need subs on certain gigs, and you start getting calls for more high level stuff, and one day you get a call to play on a film soundtrack, and then it might be another 6 months or a year before you get a call for another one. But eventually people know they can trust you. They know they can rely on you, and you're going to be professional and knock it out of the park. And that is really the only the only way I can encapsulate my own trajectory into the studios. Is I was just around. I was around for almost 10 years before I was working regularly. It was probably about 9 years actually, but in the studios. But every time I got a gig in LA, whether it was a small church gig to like a big orchestra thing or whatever, I tried to show up and bring that same idea. Check the ego at the door, be prepared and professional and collegial, and word travels over time, and take some patience, but you get there. And then as far as my own projects go, that's really where my creative fire has been for pretty much my whole professional life. So in the practice room, I'm always preparing for being able to do anything that I'm asked to do, to the best of my ability. But I'm also spending a lot of time developing my own concept of improvising and working on new ideas and writing music for various things. Most of the projects that I have are based on the people that I want to play with. So a lot of times the bands are just like, oh, I think it would be cool to play with this collection of players, and then you write music specifically for that. And then maybe, other projects don't play that stuff. You have a different concept for something else and tailor it to that. And so lately, over this last year, I've been really working on a big writing project, which is still in its kind of, it's not in its complete form yet, but it's using, I like finding sort of games for myself when I'm writing. So like I found a whole bunch of numerical sequences in some literature that I was checking out, and decided to kind of give myself those as like limiting parameters. So like I have to use this numerical sequence in this order and make sense out of it musically. So for me in this case, it's mostly metric. So it's mostly different time signatures and dealing with things that way. But it gets me out of my own, typical habits and start thinking in a new way. And
that sounds like some Anthony Braxton kind of stuff, because I know he had a bunch of mathematical things that he was into too in music and creating his stuff as well.
Totally. Well, and it's funny you mentioned Anthony Braxton. One of my very first musical memories is actually being a little kid and watching Anthony and my dad improvise together.
Oh, wow.
As, they were contemporaries at Mills College, and I was almost the same age as his son Tyonde. Tyonde is a little bit older than me, but we would, we were like little, like 2 years old or something, playing with action figures or something, and they were like jamming in the living room. And I remember looking up at whatever giant saxophone Anthony had and just going, well, what is that?
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's definitely a connection there. But yeah, I just like the idea of kind of shaking up my own concept by like finding some game or parameter that I have to kind of work within.
So with original music, where are you? What are your outlets for this? Are you playing in clubs? Are you doing like concerts? Do you have like a following you've developed, and how are you going about doing that?
Well, it's all a work in progress. We've done everything from like small bar gigs to big festival stages, and kind of everything in between. And a lot of times, because I'm involved in so much different stuff, like it's not like I'm treating that like a full-time job. So it takes a little bit longer than I'd like sometimes to develop some of the followings or like get the bookings that I'm really after. But you just keep at it and see what you can get. And it's funny, a lot of the like big opportunities that have come my way seem to have like fallen out of the sky. Like when I go to like pitch a festival and say like, hey, I'd love to bring my band here, you get radio silence. And then like other times you're not thinking about it, and like an email will come in from some festival in Europe, and they're like, hey, we saw your thing and we'd really like to bring you out, and so, I don't know. It's kind of like the studio thing. Like, I'm not totally sure how some of these things manifest, but I think it's the energy you put out. And
I think so too. It's kind of funny because our daughter, my daughter lives in Sweden, and she's a ceramicist.
Oh, cool.
And she's been out there for about a year and a half now and just kind of doing everything herself. We haven't been able to help her much because of COVID and traveling and all that stuff. But she just got a significant grant today.
Awesome.
And not that it just fell out of the sky, but when she was visiting us here a number of months back, she decided to apply for this thing and just completely forgot about it.
Yeah.
But she happened to get that today, and you're right. I mean, you have to put it out there. I think your energy is part of it, and just your presence out there is really important. So that's cool.
Well, I want to shift gears, if you don't mind, Dan, and talk about, let me see, your book. There it is, right there.
Woohoo!
And
this is a wonderful book.
It sure is. It's been kicking my butt, and in a really good way. and I really feel, even after the first day, Bobby and I were talking about this right before you signed on, we both felt that it was aligning things and getting it set up in such a good way right from the first day for me. So awesome. I want to ask you, I've seen some methods, that have breath attacks and others that have no bending, or maybe even in the same, the same routine, you might have both, but very rare do you see them both together. And I'm not sure that if that's why I felt so great after working through your book, but can you tell us, your thought of marrying those two things together?
Yeah. So I think maybe the best way to talk about it is to kind of look at like a macro into the micro kind of view. So I've actually been like refining the way that I talk about this with some students over the last year, because with the Zoom thing, you have to get a little bit more clear about it. But anyway, the way I'm thinking about it, generally speaking, is it's all a matter of becoming in tune with yourself and in tune with the instrument in a symbiotic kind of relationship. So in the macro sense, it's you really have like your focus, your mind as like the top level. So all of the exercises in the book are about like where you're placing your attention, not so much the notes that are there. And I think that's true with any successful method. It's like how you do it is much more important than like the specific exercise. But underneath that, like I think of like two umbrellas that are kind of the main things that I'm working for, which is balance and timing. So like if you have like balance, I think of as like your airstream and your embouchure and your body flexibility and tension are all kind of feeling like they're all working together in a nice cohesive kind of way. And then synchronization is about just making sure all of the elements of your technique are working together at the same moment. So with breath attacks and bends specifically, I kind of think of the elements of your technique as being like sort of four things. Like this is kind of broad strokes, but you've got the air apparatus, which is basically like everything from your torso through the way the air goes through the horn. You've got your embouchure, you've got your fingers, and you've got your tongue. And so those four things have to be working in synchronization and in balance with each other in order to play efficiently and feel, like think the horn is working for you and not against you, right? So with that in mind, the reason for the breath attacks and the bends is sort of twofold. The breath attacks, and I should note that the breath attacks in this book are really meant to be rhythmic articulations. They're not meant to be like sort of fade-ins, like a clarinet coming in. Like that's useful in other ways to practice. But for this purpose, I'm thinking of timing all the elements at the moment of release on the airstream, right? So by taking the tongue out of the equation, we remove the crutch of synchronizing with the tongue, right? A lot of times we kind of depend on our tongue to kind of line everything up in time, but by timing it from the impulse of air coming from your torso, you're kind of like one step ahead, in terms of just getting everything flowing. The other thing is it forces you to set your embouchure and release the airstream simultaneously, right? Because if you're creating a breath attack, in a rhythmic kind of way with like a kind of release, there's this impulse that should relatively immediately start the vibration of the lips, and that's true whether you're playing from a closed lip beginning or an open lip beginning. And I sort of describe three different kinds of breath attacks. One is like a closed, which would be like a poo kind of attack. One is open, which is like a foo kind of attack, and then one is very open, which is like a who kind of attack, right? So alternating between those can be really useful in just kind of finding the balance that works best for you in the horn, and also for problem solving. So like if you feel too spread open, using the poo attack to kind of bring yourself back to focus is really good. Or if you feel too like tight or open, using the foo or the who attack is kind of helpful to kind of just loosen things up and get you flowing more. So the idea is to kind of use these breath attacks at the beginning to synchronize all those aspects of your playing and sort of also run a diagnostic on the way that you feel for the day. Then by connecting those through these bends, after that initial impulse of the air attack, you're creating a sense of elasticity in the embouchure that's driven by the airstream. I kind of imagine it being like, if you imagine like a rubber band, or like I have the like a hair tie thing. Like if you imagine like stasis is like just holding it with like no added pressure or no added stretching, and then the bends kind of just like, if my thumb's the airstream, the bend kind of like just like loosens up and creates some elasticity in the embouchure. And ideally, when you come back to center, it should feel like letting go of a rubber band rather than kind of manipulating the chops to go up or down. And then there's the quote upper bend, which is basically where you finger the note a half step up but keep the pitch the same.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that John Lewis and I kind of were talking about at work, and it's also something that's in the Flexus book. And I know that it's been in a variety of other things as well, and everybody describes it slightly differently. But I think of both the lower bend and the upper bend as being a way of gauging the response point in the instrument, right? So gauging that resistance and feeling how you can kind of push against it and it pushes back, and you find that sense of elasticity like an accelerator pedal in the car. And then by flowing through an arpeggio after that, you just kind of work on sonority and getting like a beautiful flow and a beautiful sound. So in that activation series in the first part of the book, the whole idea is, synchronization with the breath attacks, flexibility with the bends, and songful, beautiful, sonorous sound with the arpeggio, right? And then you get to the low note and you just love it. You give it some juice. And that's kind of why I think it works, or at least it works for me. And then throughout the section, we keep adding partials on the upper end and flowing farther down. And my idea with that is, if you kind of center yourself on C in the staff, that puts you equidistant between the F sharp below the staff and F sharp above high C, or double C to pedal C. And so that to me seems like a logical center of the range. So I try to get to an octave on either side of that, not in a hurried way or anything like that, but I try to get to it relatively early in my practice so that like I'm treating those things the same way. So and part of that's psychological. Part of it, by like going through all of these breath attacks and like doing the bends and arpeggios, by the time you finish that first section, you've breath attacked and bent almost every note in your range, which gives you a lot of confidence in terms of like entering cold on whatever, feeling loose and flexible wherever on the horn. But also it really starts to calibrate like the way that you're putting air into the instrument with the way that the instrument, the inherent resistance in the instrument, and it really starts creating this sense of like balance and synergy between you and the horn. And ultimately, you want it to feel like just one continuous flow, so.
Yeah, that's cool. We have experienced the upper bend and everything, but it's kind of one of those things that is rarely talked about. I mean, it's mentioned here and there, but and for years and years, I mean, as a stamp student and just as students in general, right, Paul? I mean, we hear mostly about all these bending exercises going down, but that upper bend is just important, especially even when you're trying to find a note. You don't just have to go down to find the center. If you go up and down, it really shows you where it's at. That whole equidistant thing is interesting too, because many of us, including myself, typically start on G. I like the feeling of G in the morning, but I've experimented with even like a set point of say like high G above the staff, but the middle C makes a little bit more sense in the way you just described, it being equidistant from all the other octaves.
Yeah, and the elastic band explanation as well, I think was really helpful too, to realize that you're stretching and so on, but then you're coming back to a really kind of relaxed, efficient state, and I guess maybe that's why one of the reasons why it just felt so great, working through your routine is that through all of that, I kept coming back to this efficient, relaxed kind of state.
Yeah, that's really the goal. And just one other note on the bends. There, even though it's called like the upper bend, and a lot of people think of it as sort of going up, it's actually a lower bend too. Because it's basically you're going from the center of let's say C in the staff to the center of a bend from C sharp. Right. So they're both lower bends, and if students are having difficulty with it, what I usually recommend is they just do 2 bends. So, right, so they just get the feeling of that elasticity, and then it's just kind of cutting out the middleman. You go from the center of one to the center of the other. And then the way that I really try to visualize the bends, other than the rubber band thing, is it's kind of like going into the horn rather than up and down, so like if I'm bending down, I'm going farther into the lead pipe with my air. If I'm going ultimately the air is going all the way through, but you know what I mean, like you're getting into the horn more. And the same thing with the upper bend is also going in, so the elasticity is really about like kind of going forward, and then when you get to the arpeggio, it's like all the way forward, so it kind of like, I don't know, it's like stretching a balloon before you blow it up,
Yeah, so is this something like, for me, I got to be honest, I called Paul up, I think, when we talked the following day or a couple days later. And for me, I think what it did is it reiterated some things. I have a term that I like to use. Paul calls it something else, but I call it variance, and he calls it like muscle confusion. It's a sort of, when it's basically we can get into kind of a habit of playing a similar thing all the time. If you play the same volume, the same registers, the same exercises or literature, for instance, you can get locked into that. So this really got me out of that, and I felt great playing that day. But even the next day, I felt amazing,
Awesome.
And so, is this a thing like that you do typically every day, or do you just and do you do like a full like routine like you have kind of outlined here, or do you just touch on a little bit of it?
I pretty much do the whole thing. The way that I would, the qualification to that I would make is that depending on how you feel in a day, like if you feel more stiff or like dehydrated or swollen from the previous day or whatever, I take longer to get into the upper register, so I definitely recommend, especially for students, like only going as high as you feel like you can comfortably do the bends. Like if the bends are not feeling comfortable, just don't go higher, So it takes a little bit of self-restraint because it's all printed out in the book, but ultimately you want to be building the habit of feeling, that sense of relaxation and flow as you go through it. So if you practice with like tension, then that's gonna create a habit of tension. So we want to steer clear of that. But as far as the thing, I think that it's always useful to do everything in all 12 keys, and that's kind of a tenet of the book in general. So the same thing applies to the warm-up is, definitely go through all the keys, and as I get more loosened up and more comfortable, I just keep adding range on the top until, for those who haven't seen it, basically it's always starting on a higher partial and then still coming down to the same end point, so the idea being that you're, throwing of the dart in terms of the airstream is going a little farther forward, a little farther forward, a little farther forward, but then you're always relaxing through the arpeggio down. So I do that. I guess like It's probably more than I would say is really a warm up. It's more just like a routine that makes me feel kind of grounded and flexible at the same time. And it really kind of accesses the whole range that I can bring to bear that day, you know.
Well, I think the other thing we need to stress about this too is there's a whole lot of other things in this book, and we could
Yeah.
talk about it for hours. But why don't you just, this is just one little feature of this book that you don't typically see. But
Yeah.
why don't you just briefly let everybody know what else is you cover in the book?
Yeah, so the book was interesting. Like the way that it came about was actually John Lewis and I were just kind of geeking out about what we practiced while we were at work. And so I told him about this scale routine that I had come up with for myself, which included a whole bunch of varieties of scales in all 12 keys, going, expanding out from the middle. And the idea that I had was I was looking for a way to improve my dexterity for improvisation and maintain my precision of like articulation and everything for classical playing. So I was trying to come up with a routine for myself that would hit both those things at the same time. So it wasn't like separate practice. So what that became, well, anyway, I was telling John about this and he was like, you should really write that down. So I decided to just like put it in Finale because it's just something I had been practicing out of my head. And I started putting it into Finale, and then when I wrote it out in all 12 keys, I had like 50 pages of material, and I was like, wait a minute, there's a book here, so that was really the first part of what became the book, and that actually is the expansion series sort of later in the book. It's maybe the fourth, I think it's the fourth section of the book. Basically, it goes through a variety of ways of treating chromatics, everything from like alternating every note up and down across 2 octaves as a way of like really gradually crossing the registers and working the fingers, to articulating just straight chromatics, to these cascades of like, 4s and 3s and 2s, and then some other what I call Bartok scales, which are the minor third half step, minor third half step, minor third half step, or half step minor third half step minor third, and then whole tone scales, and then some triple tonguing, and then Clark stuff, and then Arbin stuff, and then some 3 different kinds of pentatonic cascades, and then some diminished scales. And I was doing that in each key. And what I found was that in conjunction with like that exercise we were talking about before with the breath attacks and the bends, going through all of that and doing all these scales, like I was feeling super consistent, throughout all the registers, either while I was improvising or while I was, doing session work, so then I kind of included some other things that I had started doing. One of which is based on like a combination of Bylin flexibilities and Schlossberg. Basically it sort of follows like the first series of Bylin, but it does it in terms of key rather than in terms of partial. And it does it with equidistant intervals. So in this case, I used like a 5th up and a 5th down, so you're traversing a 9th. So that when you go like, right, do you go through that? I guess I was just singing the 4th. But the idea is like, when you get to the octave slurs, now you're doing 9ths. So you're going past the octave, which then starts, it sort of reorients your psychology about what it feels like to play an octave slur, right? So a lot of the exercises in the book are partially about this idea of like moving evenly in all directions, and part of it is about like sort of changing your psychology about the things we normally find difficult about playing, right? And so by combining that stuff with some Schlossberg stuff and some faster flexibilities, and some like wide interval oscillations, that's the flexibility and control section, which is the 3rd section of the book. I'm kind of working backwards, I guess. And then right before that, there's this integration section. And the reason I called it integration is it was a way early in the practice to start working on things that you find to be like major challenges for you, and pairing them, or let's say putting them on either side of something that makes you feel centered. So again, kind of working out from something that feels centered. So that kind of came out of actually years and years ago while I was preparing the Francais sonatine. You know, there's that fifth sequence that opens the thing. So it's up a fifth, down a whole step, up a fifth, right? So I started putting that interval series at the end of a stamp routine. So I'd go da dee na da na da 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 da, right? So that's kind of where this idea happened, where it was like center yourself on the thing you know and connect it to the thing that you're working on, you know. And so in this book, there's two things that I'm working on, and this whole section, and really the whole book in general, is intended as like an example of like how to think about working on things, you know, so you can substitute other things in place of these exercises. But for me, triple tongue has always been difficult, you know. You know, I start with some, you know, single tonguing chromatics and triple tonguing chromatics, and then doing this exercise that I borrowed from Jim Wilt, because I would hear him doing it while he was warming up, and he says I took it to a further extreme, but I'm not sure I did. But anyway, it's just like you triple tongue up a whole tone scale with repeated notes on each. So like right, and then you go down an octave, up a tritone, down an octave, up a tritone, down an octave, you know, and so then I would do that first, then take like a slightly augmented version of the like bend and arpeggio sequence from the first section, and then add that fifth flexibility routine, but taken to an extreme. So you're going like trying to go across as much as the range precisely as you can with that series of fifths, because then it really is again kind of like divorcing your sense of flexibility from partials, right? You know, I think a lot of times it's useful for us to practice flexibility across partials, but it's limiting in terms of one, our the way our technique integrates with our understanding of harmony, and two, you know, like all, you know, if you were to see like a sequence of fifths like that printed across like, you know, multiple octaves on a gig, it'd be like, oh man, you know. But if you're practicing stuff like that all the time, then it's not really a big deal, you know. So
Right.
So the integration title comes from integrating a challenge with a grounding element, and then another challenge, you know. So like you keep kind of you go from the thing that's hard to the thing you know to the thing that's hard, you know, and like keep doing that in all 12 keys, you know. And that's kind of the overarching way the book took shape.
Yeah, it's really well thought out. So I gotta say, I gotta tip my hat to you, because we do run across a lot of books, and I have a big library of them. I believe everybody should, you know, have as much stuff to, you know, reference material as possible. And you know, I actually saw this on Wayne Bergeron's music stand, and just asked him about it a little bit, and you know, he mentioned it, and that was my introduction to it. So I hope there's a lot of people here that will really check it out. I think it's just a fantastic addition to the trumpet, you know, pedagogy here.
Yeah, and you know, anybody who's interested in checking it out, you know, I would offer one just sort of, you know, fair warning. It's hard, and it's meant to be hard, because basically it's a transcription of like my practice routine that I would use to push the limits of like what I could do in a day, you know. So I wouldn't necessarily try to play through the whole thing all at once when you first start, you know, because it's like a cross-training, you know, intensive type of workout, you know. But you can incrementally add things on, you know, as you get comfortable, and ultimately the goal is to kind of like go through it, you know, with breaks and whatnot in between. But but that's kind of the idea of it. And if you're interested, there are some, I did at the beginning of quarantine, just some like, impromptu explanations for each section of the book that are on my YouTube page. But
Yeah, we'll make sure we put those links below this here as well. Well, I know we're just about out of time here. And so I was gonna, Paul and I were talking about it earlier on, with the recording. We've all gotten, a lot of us here have gotten into recording. Can you just tell us a little bit about your recording setup and maybe just briefly touch on your record label as well?
yeah, absolutely. So, several years prior to COVID, I started building up a home studio little by little, mainly because I have this record label called Orenda Records, which does mostly DIY, sort of, maybe fringe is the right word, projects, because it's a lot of stuff that traverses a lot of different genre territory, but most of it is like sort of boundary pushing in some kind of way, or cross-pollinating ideas, or and the whole purpose of putting the label together was to represent a scene of musicians that I'm connected with, and who, by extension, we're connected with others. And it's really kind of taken on its own life. In the last 6 plus years, we've put out 86 records, and on Friday we're doing our 87th. And what's cool about it is it's really artist forward. And one of the things that was important to me was to help artists get their stuff out in the world with less sort of overhead and complication. So part of that, at first, I was helping to mix some people's records or master some people's records, and then I set up my mixing station in my former garage, and had an engineer friend come over just to hang out. And he kind of clapped around in the garage and was like, "Hell, you should record in here." And I was like, "Really? You think it'll work?" And he was like, "Yeah." So we started, I started collecting some microphones and some preamps and stuff to try to get to the point where I could record full bands in there, and at least my own projects, and make it available to anybody else that was interested. And now it's really great. I mean, we can record up to 24 channels, in the room, which is basically like a detached garage. But you can't really see it, but I've got a baby grand piano here. I've got a stack of preamps over there, a couple of guitar amps over there, and a guitar over there, and drums behind me, and a bass amp over there. And the idea is that, like, especially since a lot of this stuff is instrumental, and it's if not totally acoustic, at least balanced in an acoustic kind of way. So the idea is, if we can get get to sound like you're in the room with us, then it's a really engaging kind of thing, and I think it sounds awesome. So we, even early on, started to get sounds that I felt were as good as sounds that I was getting from studios I would rent. So that kind of took on its own life. And then once COVID hit, we did a lot of home recording. So I kind of dialed some things in more, kind of, set up, made some improvements. For my own trumpet recording setup, I use a Royer 122V. This mic is just for teaching lessons and doing interviews and stuff like that. But
what is the V for? I know they have an R, right? But
right. So the R122. So the R121 is the one that most people know, and that's a standard ribbon mic, that they engineered, and it's a wonderful mic. The 122 is a phantom powered version of that, and the reason that you might want to have a phantom powered ribbon microphone is a passive ribbon microphone takes a lot of gain, and you need a lot of clean gain from a really high quality preamp. If you want to use a preamp that doesn't have quite as much gain, you need phantom power to get enough signal out of the microphone. And then the 122V is basically like the 122, but it's vacuum tube powered, meaning that it's got a combination of the ribbon quality with the tube microphone quality. So the reason I got that is for my own solo stuff. I used to use a large diaphragm tube condenser and a ribbon microphone as a pair. And on my previous record, Absurd in the Anthropocene, the engineer who recorded it wanted to use this 122V on me, and he was like, "Look, it'll be cool. Like you'll hear just as much like warmth and kind of tubiness in the sound by just using this one mic, and then you don't have potential phase issues or anything like that." So I tried it, and I thought it sounded great, and then I sort of kept my eye out on Reverb.com for like a used one that I could afford, and then pulled the trigger once I could. And I think it sounds really great. But the 121 is fantastic. The Coles 4038 is fantastic. I love AEA microphones. I've got several of them. And the thing is, ultimately with microphones and recording, it's really all about placement. It's all about where you place the microphone. I mean, you can get a great trumpet sound on an SM57 if you place it in the right spot. And some of that takes experimenting, because it largely depends on the room and how reflections are happening in the room and where you're pointed and all that kind of stuff. So you need to experiment. But that's one of the things that having a studio like this has been amazing for us. Like, if I can mic the drums up with like 8 microphones, and the piano with 2 to 4 microphones, and the bass with a microphone and a DI and the guitar amp and the trumpet and the saxophone, and still have it sound clear on everything, because you start understanding how the polar pickup patterns both receive and reject sound. And you start understanding how the different mic placements can complement each other. So, like one of the things that the late great Al Schmidt was all about was having leakage that worked to your benefit. So like if you saw him record a big band at Capitol, everybody's sitting there together, and there's mics on everybody, but they're all open, like nobody's isolated. And you go in the mixing, or you go in the booth, and all the faders are at 0. They're not running through any compressors or anything, and it sounds like a finished record. So ultimately it can work to your advantage to have some extra bleed in there. But that's been a really super cool learning experience. Trying to kind of wrap my head around like how the acoustics are working and how the microphones are seeing and rejecting sound, and it's fascinating. I geek out on it.
Well, we should probably, I think we're running out of time here, but we want to put up your URL. So if somebody wants to find your book, where would they go to find that?
So if you go to danrosenboom.com, there's a link. I think it's under the store. Up at the top, there's like a store drop down.
Okay.
And there's a link right there for the Boom Method, and that's the book, and that'll take you, I think, to Carl Fisher's website where it's available now.
Great, and we'll make sure that we post that as well when we post your interview up.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for being here. You've given us a lot of really great information. Congratulations on the book. Highly recommended here. And, and feel free to chime in on some of the conversations that are going on. Love having you in the group. And
awesome.
let's stay in touch and keep us apprised of what's going on. And when you have a new book or a new CD or something, let us know. We'll bring you back to talk about it.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys bringing me in, and thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, very cool. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.